Okay. To those of you who are joining us for this event, welcome. We're going to give just a few more minutes for more people to join us and for our setup here. And in the meantime, I will share with you some information about more unlearned events that you might want to check out. Right. Sharing some information with you all, and welcome. Continuing to welcome you to our event. If you're here for the library panel, changing the subject, you are in the right place. In just a few minutes here, we'll get started. We are hoping to welcome your comments and questions today. So feel free to use the chat or the Q&A, which is on the side of your screen here. We'll be monitoring that throughout, and then we'll have some time at the end to address your thoughts and engage in a little bit of discussion with you. Maybe just to get started, you can say hi in the chat. We can test if that's working out for everybody. Hello. Yes, we're happy to welcome you all here. This is a first time for some of us using WebEx, so bear with us as we are getting our bearings, and hopefully it'll be a fun and interesting discussion with some things for us all to think about and learn about today. If you have any issues with your audio or video from us not being able to hear or see us well, you can also feel free to put that in the chat. All right. So I think we will get started here pretty soon. Well, let me begin just by introducing myself. My name is Amanda Mattice. I'm one of the librarians at Heckman Library, and I will be the moderator presenter for our lovely group of panelists today, who are my colleagues, other librarians here. So we were hoping to share some video clips from a documentary called Changing the Subject today, and we're working on the logistics of that. If that doesn't work, if we can't share that with you in this session, I want to invite you to join our watch party, which is happening later tonight at 7 p.m. We're going to be posting a link to the MetaStream viewing on our library website. So, yeah. All right. I guess we're going to move forward with a little bit of some details about this documentary, in case you want to know more about it, in case we can't show it. Then I'd like to introduce our panelists to everybody, and we'll get started with our conversation. So the documentary, Change the Subject, is about a campaign begun by students at Dartmouth in 2014, when some students brought attention to the use of a subject heading in their library's catalog for undocumented people in the United States. The subject heading was illegal aliens. And this sparked a lot of conversation and controversy, not only in their community, but it became kind of a national flashpoint in discussions about immigration, the language that we use to describe people who are not citizens. And they worked hard to propose that this be changed in the library cataloging system, and learned a lot about how libraries organize information, as well as I think a lot of us in the library world began to learn more, or unlearn, I guess you could say, according to the themes of our week here, began to unlearn some of the things that we've been maybe a little blind to in the library system about racism and bias and other issues about how we impact our communities. So, without giving too much more away, I think that it would be, a great learning opportunity for everyone to check out this documentary. So you can join us for the watch party later tonight, or you can check it out for yourselves on PBS. It is free to view for the rest of this year, I believe. So, without further ado, I think I'd like to introduce our panelists. We have a few different librarians from Heckman today joining us to share a little bit about their experience working in the library and their perspective on the topics that we've been talking about all week here. So let me go ahead and turn it over to our first panelist, Francine Lewis. If you could just unmute yourself, say hi, and tell us what's your role in Heckman and how long have you worked there?
Hi, everyone. My name is Francine Lewis. I'm the head of collection management at the Heckman Library. I'm also the cataloging librarian. I've been working at Heckman now since the Thanksgiving of 1986, so almost 34 years coming up. And during that time, I have seen a lot of different changes in terms of cataloging and cataloging structures and organizations and so on. So it's been interesting. I think people started looking at this, not even in 2014, but there's been a lot of discussion on critical cataloging and information and knowledge organization, probably since the beginning of the 2000s when I did some research on it. So onward to the rest of you.
Yeah, thank you. And we look forward to unpacking what goes into cataloging and why does that matter in this discussion. How about Catherine next?
Hi, my name is Catherine Swore, and I'm the Collection Development Librarian at Heckman Library. I've been at the library for 8 years, and I recently wrote a diversity and inclusion plan for our collection development policy, so hopefully have a chance to talk about that a little bit in our conversation today. Thanks.
And we also have Sarah Kolk.
Hello, everyone. I'm Sarah Kolk. I'm one of the research and instruction librarians. So my main role is to work with students in the classroom. And a large part of what I do is teach students how to be more effective searchers. So I'm going to be speaking with you a little bit about some of the bias that can come in when we search. And this has just been an area of interest of mine since library school. Oh, I forgot to say how long I've been at Heckman. That was your central question. I've been at Heckman since 2005, so 15 years.
Great. And last but not least, we have David Malone, who is also helping me moderate chat today. And you can chime in, David, and introduce yourself as well.
Sure. I'm David Malone, Dean of the Library. I've been at Calvin 4 years now, and I'm really excited that we're able to have this panel, and I'm so glad that you all are here with us today.
Awesome. Thank you, everybody. Let me ask you all, by way of expanding on this introduction, another question here. And I'd like to know, or maybe we can tell our audience a little more about what formative library experiences have you had, or maybe another way of putting this, what has led you to value libraries or to question them, originally or recently? We can start again maybe with Francine and just popcorn your way through in response.
Sure, I'll start. I don't know. I've always valued libraries ever since I was a kid, and I made my own card catalog. True story. In a 3x5 card recipe box. But a couple years ago, connected to more social justice and the topic at hand, I attended a library conference that was working hard, and it still is, to draw in librarians of color and to really talk about this this discussion about racial equity within libraries. And at the opening session, there was a person from the area who was invited to speak on the history and culture of the city where the conference is held. And the conference that year was being held in Atlanta. The white male speaker told a number of very racially insensitive anecdotes, bringing up singing and dancing, slavery, plantations, and so on, that were really triggering and very full of microaggressions. I was sitting next to a fellow librarian who happened to be of color, who had won a scholarship, and I found out later that she was very upset about this, rightfully so. Here was a conference that was giving her, as a librarian of color, a scholarship and, you know, welcoming her in one hand, and yet providing as a platform in this very public address something that she felt was really demeaning, very aggressive, and it was really hard. The conference did come back. There was a lot of discussion. The offense was addressed directly. They apologized, the president of the conference, planners, and so on. And then they tried to do better. So they tried to unlearn what was going on. The next year, one of the keynote speakers was a wonderful and very powerful speaker, a woman of color, who talked on diversity and equity in library science. So that, I won't say that was the start of my journey in looking at libraries, but it was, I think, a very pivotal moment in looking at libraries and library systems and how this discussion is embedded in just so many different ways and at so many different levels in the library world.
All right. Can we hear from Sarah or Catherine, maybe, about your own experiences, either originally what has been something you valued or questioned, or more recently?
Sure, I can go, I guess. Yeah, I would say that one relatively recent experience was reading the article that was introduced the concept of vocational awe in librarianship. I think many librarians sort of assume a posture of either kind of defensiveness or a kind of sort of celebration of our inspirational role. So a lot of times the culture will sort of stereotype librarians, right? Portray us as old-fashioned or out of touch, or on the other hand, they'll portray librarians as sort of the saviors of the universe. So I thought this particular article, Vocational Awe, did a really nice job of challenging librarians to sort of give up this inspirational role, to notice the ways in which perhaps our profession and our ways of organizing libraries are not quite as sacred as we had always imagined that they were, that there really are a lot of problems that we can try to address. So I just thought that was a really helpful challenge to our profession. So yeah, I think that was a good moment to sort of think through these issues.
Yeah, and I'll just share as well. This spring, I took a course sponsored by Library Journal called Evaluating, Auditing, and Diversifying Your Collections. The class had a variety of speakers present on topics of diversity and inclusion in libraries, and they really spoke about turning a critical eye on your collection and investigating what voices are missing from your collection and what voices may be marginalized in your collection. It really made me think about libraries in a new light. Like Sarah was saying, we kind of hold libraries up as these honorable institutions of wisdom, and really they're biased just like everything else. They're biased by who writes the books, who gets to be published, and who collects the books and puts them in the library. And librarians have unconscious biases that affect what we collect. And so that's something that really hit home for me as collection development librarian, is what biases am I bringing to the table, and what, if we look at our collection at Calvin, what voices maybe aren't being heard, or groups being marginalized by what we collect and what we don't collect.
Great. Okay. Thank you all for weighing in on that. I think I can speak to a lot of us saying that, you know, libraries have a very special role in how we have grown up, how we continue to look at the world, and what we continue to contribute to the world. But like a lot of you have mentioned, we've begun to unpack some of the ways that libraries have been influenced, as well as how they have been an influence on topics like these. So we're going to talk today a little bit about some different ways where libraries intersect with the fight for racial justice. There's lots of different ways that we can talk about this. Just to begin with, though, we're going to go back to what is the subject of the documentary that we have been focused on. So the world of cataloging. And so to kind of lead us in that part of our discussion, I have a few questions for Francine to begin with. Can you sort of explain a little bit more to us how are subject headings a part of the system that libraries use to organize information? What are subject headings, and what is it we're talking about here?
Oh, wow. So, yeah, we're basically looking at something that could take all day to try to explain, but I will try not to. So this is a quote from the Library of Congress's subject heading overviews at their website. But basically, subject headings are a list of words and phrases called headings, that are used to indicate the topics of library resources. Sometimes we look at Twitter and we add hashtags. They're kind of like the old version of hashtags on Twitter or on Instagram or other social media types where you're trying to pull like things together. It's used by most academic and research libraries in the United States, many public libraries and school libraries. These Library of Congress subject headings are basically used around the world in order to bring consistency to library collections by categorizing topics into logical arrangements and by controlling synonyms, narrow terms, like terms, broader terms, to build a gigantic classification or organization of knowledge at a variety of levels, trying to pull things together. So, for example, one person might think about the concept of what we in Michigan here call soda, right? Or pop. And other places call them fizzy drinks. Other places are, you know, if you're more, might be carbonated beverages or soft drinks. All of those, you have to decide what is the best term that most people will recognize on a subject heading or as a heading or a way to pull that information together. And so the Library of Congress has a wide-ranging process by which they come up with the term and where it's been used and so on and so forth. And then they decide upon appropriate words that try to capture that concept. Then that way things are all pulled together. It's not set in stone, because if we had been able to watch some of the documentary, and as it will show up later at the watch party, there's some discussion there by saying that a heading is set as a language term, right? That it doesn't change, and that's not true. In the 1990s, I remember the heading for what we call movies now was moving pictures. That was 1990s. That's not that long ago. And even then they changed it to motion pictures, what it is today. And nobody ever thinks of a movie or as a film as a moving picture or as a motion picture. You think of it as a movie or as a streaming service or something. I mean, that's all changed. Same thing for a long time, the word for the heading aged was changed to older people fairly recently. Or physically handicapped was recognized as not using anymore, and they changed it to people with disabilities following the language change there. So subject headings do change, but the change takes a lot of time and a lot of thought and a lot of energy, primarily because it's basically around the world, and they take into account how things are used and where. So as we talk about it, we know words matter, language matters, naming things matter. I know David likes to talk about Adam and Eve and how Adam named things in the garden, right? So he sees Adam as maybe the early cataloger, organizing the animals and giving them all names. And yeah, and we know from fantasy stories like Ursula Le Guin and Earthsea, one of the major themes there is that naming and knowing something's true name and giving something a true name gives it power, gives you power over it, or provides a power and a connection. And so we have to give things names and organization, and that gives us power over them, but it places them in context, it imparts meaning by what they're in proximity to. So I hope that gives people a little bit more idea of what subject headings are and why they're important within the library's catalog. And they aren't just in the library's catalog, but this word and this language shows up in research databases and in Google and all sorts of places around that we don't necessarily know where they end up.
Yes, thank you. I love the call out to Ursula Le Guin and Earthsea. I think there's a clear understanding, especially in this day and age, that that our words have a lot of significance, and that's something, maybe that's hard for some people to grasp. I think some people have more of a mindset of, a rose by any other name. And that was the reaction, as you can see from the documentary, that was the reaction of many people who were opposed to this student campaign, who said, well, what does it matter if we use the term illegal aliens? Like, that's what we've always used, and that can be part of what slows the wheels of progress in the great system of library organization. But it was a conversation that was very worth having. There's a quote that I'd love to be able to share from the documentary, from one of the professors, talking about how it's not just a word on a page. It does, like you said, Francine, it has power. What kind of power struggle are we initiating when we call a person illegal? Something that was, something that's worth it for all of us to think about, especially us as librarians, but also for the community to think about. So let me transition to another idea, another thing for us to think about. And that is the kinds of bias that can come up in library information organization when it comes to searching. Searching for information, whether you're using the library or whether you're using Google, there are a lot of things that can influence that. And to talk about that, I have a few questions for Sarah. So let's unpack a little bit. What do we take for granted when it comes to searching for information? And how do searching systems really work? I think maybe both of us have some experience with explaining to people that it's not as straightforward as it seems.
Sure. I'll just say up front that I'm not an expert on this, and if there are any any computer scientists in attendance, they can feel free to correct me in the chat later. But I often explain to English 101 students that searching isn't magic, right? I think that's the main principle that I want to convey, and that is, it's not as if the computer can read your mind. There are algorithms that go on, and sometimes when we think about algorithms, when you use that word algorithm, we imagine math, which seems objective and neutral. So, I mean, that's the issue, is that algorithms are ways of interpreting inputs in order for us to get outputs, and there has to be some kind of interpretation there. So fundamentally, that's the message, right? Is that searching is not magic, and searching is not neutral, and algorithms aren't neutral. The algorithms are created by humans. At Google, they have many humans, right, who are creating the algorithms. And, again, we think that, well, there are all these people, surely amidst all of their work, problems are addressed, right? They've got so many people working on this, they would figure out how to make it better. And they do, right? We've seen that throughout the years that Google has gotten better in making their relevancy ranking and all sorts of things become better. So then there's that issue too. We can think about even the question of relevancy, right? We imagine that when we type into Google, that they're going to return the best results, and the best results are the most relevant. So then that raises the question, well, relevant to whom? relevant to the searcher, who is this imagined generic person, right? So yeah, there are a lot of questions that we can raise. One of the things that I also like to point out is a book that was written a couple of years ago in 2018 called The Algorithms of Oppression. So this was by a library science researcher, Sophia Noble. So if you haven't read this book, we have it in our collection. You can also find it on Amazon. So she described the ways that that Google in particular and search engines really reflect the values of the companies and the corporations behind the search engines. And she tells some really moving and troubling stories of her own experience as a Black woman and being asked by a colleague, well, have you tried searching for Black girls or Asian girls? And the results that come back were pornography. So she reported on this. She gave a TED talk about this. She was quite widely sort of published and interviewed about this. And of course, it's different now. Again, so then we can sort of say, well, Google solved that problem. They solved the problem of the racist results that came back. But Sophia Noble's point is that it's not just that kind of instance. It's the whole kind of system behind the search engine. There's another researcher, and it's not just Google. There's another researcher, Matthew Reedsma, who's actually at Grand Valley State University, and he talks about it in terms of also the library system. Some libraries, not our own, use something called discovery tools, and he's done some research into the ways in which even sort of official library discovery tools reflect bias as well. And again, it has to do with how relevancy is considered, how things are ranked, right? That there are values that are perpetuated through those systems. So I could say some other things about that, but those are basically, the thing about Google is that this algorithm is a black box. We don't know. They tell us some of the factors that they consider, but they're not completely forthcoming because it's a business and they need to make money on it. And even in the library systems, we don't always know exactly how our vendors and our own tools have how they decide to rank and yeah, what their algorithms look like either. We can try to figure it out, but we don't always know either. So I'll stop there because I could mention some other questions I think that this raises, but that's I think mostly just understanding the value systems that underlie search systems is what we need to remember.
Yeah, thank you. I think one big takeaway, thinking about what happens when we search for things, is to realize that the tools we've made for searching, whether that's Google or library systems as well, despite all of their sophistications, they're still dependent on the input that you provide. And, a lot of us, might not be, we might not have all of the understanding to know exactly what to put in to return results that are really relevant to us. So let me ask you another question, Sarah, about what can we do to be more aware of the bias that is often hidden in these tools, and are there like some strategies that we can employ to sort of avoid these pitfalls?
I think what we can do most kind of simply is just not to rely on one search tool, right? To try to use as many as we can. I think also we can, there's DuckDuckGo, for example, is another search engine, right? I think we all think that Google is the only one that's available. We could use other search engines. We can also, I think, draw on other people and ask them about, if we're not sure if our own inputs, our own search queries are sort of creating some kind of biased results, we might talk about it with a colleague or talk about it with a friend or talk about it with another librarian and really think about, as you said, the language that we're using ourselves and is that appropriate. I think also we can, as much as we can, just continue as citizens to put pressure on, on corporations and on whether it's Facebook or Google or whatever, right? They've come under pressure more these days, but we can continue to put that pressure on them and help them to recognize the work that they need to do so that we have more just systems, right? So it is sort of being a good citizen in that way.
Yeah, I think it's the part of every citizen to seek out reliable information, to be informed, and librarians are a great resource for that. As much as we must struggle and fight against bias in our own systems, we are constantly on the lookout for these things as well. We understand the nature of the information world. So librarians are a great thing to have in your toolbox when you have questions about, how do I know what kind of information to trust? But turning back to, I guess, sort of the trustworthiness of information, back onto the library a little bit. There has been a saying or a perspective on libraries for a long time, which was this idea of libraries as a neutral place, that we should exist not with any kind of particular agenda, but just as an access point for people to get information. That it was not our responsibility or even within our power to do more than that. Which is what we've started to think more about, though, is whether libraries really are neutral or should they be? So those two questions I'm going to pose to all of our panelists here. If anyone wants to pop in and speak a little on that, what do you think about libraries as neutral spaces?
Well, I'll start. So as I was doing some preparation for this panel, it was fascinating. Some of the things, I had to go back and read some of the articles that, in more detail that I came across. But there was one that talked about how much, now this gets back to algorithms and so on too, but classification, the way that we store information and where its proximity is. And you would think that the Library of Congress subject, or not even the subject headings, the call numbers that you assign are based in a biased, in non-neutral setting. One of the things I discovered was that much of the underlying structure of the call number system, the classification system, was based in early or late 19th, early 20th century sociology and ethnic studies in some ways, coming out of Charles Darwin and evolutionary biology. And so you start to think what kinds of things between eugenics and that discussion were pushing classification schemes already at that time. And that's what the basis of what we have now as our call number schemes are running. So when you think about it being a neutral space, classification systems are highly skewed towards Anglo-American concepts of the world. Upper middle class, heterosexual, able-bodied white man view of the world. Looks like Dewey, which is most of the resources there are skewed towards Christianity versus the entire world's possible religions. Subject headings, the discussion about illegal aliens. Let's see, name authority records, which we haven't even talked about yet. So you have subject headings, but you also have trying to pull people's different names together and looking at the discussions around gender identity and labeling people there without their consent or knowledge, or using people's dead names versus their names that they've transitioned to. That's a lot of the discussion that we're having in collection management, cataloging, and knowledge organization. So yeah, I don't think, at least I was like, oh, call numbers, they should be somewhat neutral, right? Well, no, sorry. Move on.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Like, there's lots of ways that once you start to think about it, once we have begun to think about it, the ways that we organize information, it starts to like crumble a little under scrutiny to reveal some things about what have we prioritized, and how has that influenced the way that we classify information. Does anyone else want to weigh in on this idea of libraries as neutral spaces?
I can say something about that, I guess. I think I think that what librarians have tried to say is that, yes, that we don't take a stand, that we try to be fair and balanced, right? I think a lot of times this comes up in both the services that we provide and also the resources that we have. But as we're all sort of realizing, yeah, the priorities that we take, the decisions that we make, they're either an act or an act of omission, right? Some choice has to be made, right? So in terms of services, we either provide a service that may help people, or we don't provide a service, and by not providing that, it's not, right? I mean, so it's sort of, there's always an it's not an infinite set of choices, right? So I think, it comes up in public libraries a lot of times. This is always a question that's the debate questions at library conferences is, should there be meeting spaces that are available for for anybody, whatever their political persuasion is, right? Should we allow Nazis to rent meeting rooms, that kind of thing? Well, if you do, then you're not letting somebody else have that meeting room, right? So this is I think the context of it is that we may imagine that we're being neutral, but we're always making choices either to provide a service or to provide a resource, or we're not.
Yeah, I'll jump in as well. I think there's some great examples of the disparities that have existed in access to libraries. So we think of library internally, is it neutral or not? Well, the existence of have not had this access to libraries. There's some great scholarship out there by Aisha Johnson Jones and others that looks at the role of libraries in communities of color, particularly during the 20th century, where Julius Rosenwald established schools throughout the South because there wasn't even equal access to primary and secondary education. Even during the civil rights movement, the growth or the institution of freedom schools, Supreme Court had ruled in separate but equal, but even it wasn't equal. states would spend twice, 3, 4 times as much on white students versus black students. And so the creation of freedom schools, where then freedom libraries were opportunities to expand the access to information and resources for students. And I think of the little free libraries that you see out and about are those good examples of where in micro communities people can expand the access to a wide range of resources.
Yeah, it's great to think about not only the systems and whether whether the foundations of a library are neutral or not, but also whether the impact that libraries have on their communities, whether that's neutral. So transitioning a little bit from that point, I would like to talk a little bit about representation and collection development with our final panelist, Catherine. Thinking about the resources that are in the library and what that has to do with this discussion of racial justice and bias. Let me just ask Catherine, because you mentioned it earlier, what is Heckman doing to support diversity in its collection? You've been particularly involved in that.
I have. So I, like I said, wrote a collection development policy around diversity and inclusion and what we can do to commit to doing that. And it's one thing to put in writing that we value diversity and inclusion, and it's another thing to actually prove that we're meeting the goals that we've set for ourselves. And so one of the things that I've tried to design is to do a diversity and inclusion audit of our collection, and that looks for gaps in the collection, like I said earlier, where are there groups that are being marginalized, or are we collecting books that are, how many books that we have that are by old white men, kind of thing. So another example would be we could collect books on African American history. Maybe we have a lot of books on African American history, but how many of those books are written by African Americans? Or we may collect books on LGBTQ issues, but what year were they published? Maybe we have a lot of books on that topic, but they were published before the year 2000, then we're not doing our job in collecting. That we need to have more current collections. We need to pay attention to who's writing the things that we're collecting. And so those are a couple of examples of what I'd like to do in terms of auditing our collection and making sure that we're meeting the standards that we set for ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, that's great. And I want to, I want this to be an opportunity for our participants who are listening to know about, at Heckman Library here, we are taking this issue seriously, not just thinking about it, but trying to work towards some actionable goals for it. And here's another question for you, Catherine. Why would you say it's important to represent diverse experiences in an academic library like Heckman?
Sure. Well, Calvin University prioritizes diversity and inclusion in its strategic plan. So we want to piggyback off of that at the library for sure. And if we're trying to attract faculty and students of color to the university, then our collection needs to represent those people and serve them well. I think, like I said before, if those groups are feeling marginalized, or a student of color sits down to do a research project and they can't find what they're looking for, the library needs to step up and fill those gaps. Just from a Christian perspective, of course, we want to love our neighbors, be hospitable, and reconcile with different people who are underserved. And we apply the verse from Revelation that from the people are from every nation, tribe, people, and language in the new kingdom, that we should really reflect the variety of God's creation and the gifts that people bring from different backgrounds. And we can learn a lot from people who are different from us. And so I think those are some ways that we see it's important to be intentional about what we collect.
Yes, thanks for bringing in also our values as Christians. Heckman Library at a Christian university, we are in a unique position to critically evaluate what kind of service that we're offering in the library, what kind of resources that we're offering as a library, and what that says about the values of the library here. And you in the community have a role to play in that as well. We base our collection policies, quite often we base a lot of things, we make a lot of our choices based on the needs of the community. So communicating with us and being involved in the library world and learning more about what we do helps us in making our library a more inclusive place for everyone. So we're happy to have an event like this to share with you all what are the things that are on our hearts as librarians when it comes to racial justice, and what can we do together? How can we talk about this together to make things better for us and for all of you patrons who love the library? So that being said, I think now would be a good time to open up to any audience questions or comments. We have had a few little comments popping up in here, and I'll let David to share with us anything that he's noticed in the chat, or give our audience members a minute to send us some more thoughts. Yep.
Yeah, I think one of the questions that neutrality. I don't know if any of the panelists have anything particular to say in relation to that. I know that early on there was at least mention of inherent biases, but if there's anything further.
I'll let anyone who wants to respond to that go ahead.
Well, I think Sarah talked a little bit too of this when she was talking about biases and algorithms. I mean, we like to think of neutrality, right, as maybe objectivity or, balance. I think, and I think Sarah also mentioned that too, that we're looking to provide resources for both places, but we only have a finite budget. So as she was mentioning, you could have the meeting room, but we only have so much money to purchase things. So if we are buying one thing, what can we not afford or cannot purchase as the corollary to that? So neutrality it's not necessarily like Switzerland's per se, but more of a balance or objectivity that we're trying to portray in terms of library systems. And whether that's even a possibility, I don't think so. The more we look at it, I think the systemic biases and are just so ingrained back to the beginnings of some of the libraries and our knowledge systems that we may be pretending we're swimming right in this new world of neutrality, but really it's because we are white middle-aged women and men who are of a particular class and ethnicity, and so to us it looks as if it's neutral and unbiased, when really if we were from a different person of color or a different class, ethnicity, it could be very different. Anybody else?
We don't have any questions yet from our attendees. Something pop up in the Q&A, but I've asked the attendees if they have any areas that they think of Heckman that might be biased, and we'll see if anything comes in here. Yeah, here's a question that came in that the panelists can address. They're wondering what places or avenues that you use to learn about new books and resources. So that's to the collection development process. There's new books being produced all the time, or even other resources. How do you find stuff?
Sure, I can take that question. There's a wide variety of ways that we can find out about new things, and our primary resource at the library is faculty letting us know what they need and what they use in their classes. And we supplement what faculty request for us by using a review service called Choice. It's from the American or Association of College and Research Libraries, where they review academic books and compile those reviews in a way that makes it easy for librarians to go through by subject and look at what's being published. All of those reviews are written by experts in their field, and they are rating them on their usability for undergraduates, for graduates, for professionals, and whatnot. Other ways that we can look at new content is by searching conference proceedings, searching what people are talking about on blogs and listservs on particular topics. And I'm on a listserv for business librarians, so they're talking about things that are being published, and they're talking about things that are working and not working for them. And so it's a lot to keep track of in a small library where you have a lot of responsibilities for different liaison areas that we work with in the library, work with a lot of different departments, not just business, but education, economics, math and statistics, and classical studies. We all have our full plates in front of us, but we do our best to keep a finger on the pulse of what's being talked about, and maybe others can share what they do too.
I will certainly use things like the New York Times, some popular based resources in terms of what is the culture talking about, so that we can kind of be ahead of the curve a little bit, because it can take a while from once a title is identified. It's not an immediate process. You go to the bookstore, shop on Amazon, and in a few days it's in your hands. Well, a lot of that descriptive work and physical processing, it could take 4, 6, 8 weeks sometimes to make it to the shelf. So I try and look at more popular resources, but I will also utilize bibliographies. So a key title that had maybe came out a few years ago or more recently, I'll look through the sources that scholar was using and saying, do any of these things fit our collection? Should we have these? And to be able to round out that conversation.
Yeah, and on the other sort of related to that, following bibliographies, another way is to follow scholarly journals. Sometimes reading the reviews that are in not just from librarians, but from the scholars in the field as well. I find that helpful. For example, as a liaison to communication, reading some of the communication journals and seeing what kind of scholarship is going on there, and seeing how they seeing the reviews in their journals too.
We have a question wondering, how does the library try to be unbiased in its hiring of students? Do we try to hire students from different ethnic groups represented at the university? I think we might have a representative pool of the library that doesn't hire a lot of students, particularly that some of the areas that have more the student staff aren't on this panel.
Yeah.
Maybe I can explain a little bit more about how students are hired at the library. We typically have students working for us in the circulation department, some in the cataloging and collection development department, and also a group of students that we work with as research consultants. And we don't have anyone from access services from the circulation department on this panel, but we do have a few in the other departments. If anyone has some experience they'd like to share about that.
I can speak to an internal process that the university has for reviewing academic and co-curricular departments like the library. And part of that process is to look at our own diversity and inclusion efforts. And we are asked to describe through self-identification among our permanent staff as well as our student staff what sorts of diverse elements are representative, ethnicities, nationalities, etc.
I think I can also add to that I work with the research consultant students. And I think I can speak for all of us saying that we want the students who are working with us to reflect the community, and that the ethnicity of students should never be a barrier to their being hired to work with us. And so we hope that you will see students of all kinds working in the library, and that is part of what we consider when we hire students, as well as other requirements depending on the position. So do we have any other questions? I will continue to let David go on.
We have another question of what are some of the difficulties that librarians you all have encountered as you try and acquire diverse materials?
I'll speak to this one, and maybe Catherine and David and so on. As I've been here for a long time, one of the places that has changed over time has been self-published materials. And we used to get a lot of self-published materials. People send them to us out of the blue. We, at one time, I remember, got the complete works of L. Ron Hubbard, the leader of Scientology, all 20 to 30 volumes of his collected works sent to us for free And in the instance there, we picked out a couple of them that were representative, because putting things on the shelves and storing materials is also not neutral. What you have room for is finite. And if we store everything from everyone, we will run out of room and energy and funds to keep other things on the shelves. So looking at, you would think, why don't we just keep all of those? Well, it's also taking valuable space from other materials. So changing in receiving gifts has been, at least as head of collection management, one of my difficulties. We get a lot of things from people who want to donate materials, but in terms of processing, cataloging, assigning subject headings, taking care of the materials, physically processing them, takes a lot of energy and time that we should probably be spending towards things that we are actually paying for. And right now, with the rise of the ability for people to self-publish materials, that's been a discussion that we're having currently within the larger library, larger world right now too, is how much of those do we find of use and of value. So that's kind of an interesting discussion about a particular area of collection management and collecting that we're still currently having conversations around.
I've got one.
Oh, I was going to add some. Can I add something really quick? Okay. I would say another challenge that we face is just what's being published. So we could say, like, well, we would really like to collect more books by African American authors on this particular topic, but if they don't have the opportunity to get published, then we're stuck. And so just to share with you some statistics from the Lee and Low book survey, looking at diversity in the publishing industry, as a whole, looking at the presidents of the company and the editors who work for the company, publishing industry is 76% white, 74% cisgender women, 81% straight, and 89% non-disabled. And so if you think about biases in the library, there's also biases in the publishing industry, based on who's in power and who gets to choose what's getting published. And so that's another thing that we're up against when we want to pick things. Thanks.
So I don't know if any who might want to respond to this, but there's a question about how do we combat confirmation bias when we're doing research, especially with search engines being personalized. There's a great TED Talk out there by Eli Pariser that talks about the Google bubbles and the filter bubbles that occur that, we have numerous attendees today, and each one of those people would get different search results out of Google. So anyone have anything to say about how to challenge one's own confirmation bias?
Yeah, I think one just quick tip that I have, I think if we think about our current kind of political climate in terms of our confirmation bias as we sort of consume the media, and that's oftentimes what we're thinking about when we ask this question, right? Is that, personally, I deliberately try to have a balanced media diet and try to seek out media platforms that may have a different perspective. And so, there's a website called allsidesnews.com, which presents different political media from different political perspective. And it sort of lays out the different, a headline as it's presented in a right thinking publication versus a left thinking versus one that's considered centrist. So really kind of doing some deliberate comparison and deliberate seeking out of other perspectives. Also, I think doing a little bit of digging into publications and sort of their purposes as well. Librarians have tools, our own kind of professional tools that we can kind of dig into, you know, what's the history of this publication? Who are the editors? We can't learn everything about it, but doing that kind of background work into who is this, what is their purpose. So also yourself doing that kind of background research too.
Great, appreciate that that website link. There's also the Ad Fontes Media Bias chart that is constantly being revised and is a great way to just have a sense of where something is. So if you're reading HuffPost, read National Review as well. Get kind of both ends there. One last question that we have here is, I need to scroll while I do that. So what are Heckman's considerations regarding biases in translated materials like the Odyssey or the Quran?
I know.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, that's all right. Well, I'm also, along with my head of collection management hat, I'm also the librarian who works with the world languages. So French, German, Spanish, French, and so on, and Asian languages. When you're talking, you're almost talking about slightly different things between Quran, Odyssey, Iliad. Those are more classics, which probably have more published translations out there. So one of the things we certainly could do is make sure we have more recent publications, more recent translations of those older, more classic works, so that they maybe incorporate changes in language or culture or discussions, things like that. Words from ancient Greek, you get different nuances, just like you would in different translations of the Bible. Is the same thing you would be looking for different translations with Homer or you know, the Quran or other religious classics. When you get to more recent materials, one of the things that I'm trying to do for the world languages is, if we have something in one language, can I find the English translation, if possible, of that same work, so that students would have not just the classic or the original, but also maybe have a good translation, accredited translation of that material, so that you don't just go to Google Translate and try to type in bits and pieces and figure out of your own head and or their crazy translation algorithms what exactly is going to be coming up. So that's one of the things I'm trying, at least, as we're collecting towards other world language materials, and that we do get things from a wide variety of cultures and or people. Do we have things in variety of languages that support our students, our curriculum, and so on and so forth. So, Catherine, do you have anything to say about this as well?
Not really.
So let me just put out there for all of our attendees, this session block we have from 3 to 5, so we're not trying to rush or cut off the conversation at all, but since we weren't able to share our documentary clips today, we can probably plan on wrapping up a little bit sooner. So feel free to continue sharing some questions that you have for us. And if not, if people are feeling happy about this conversation, we'll just have a few concluding questions to wrap things up. David, do we have anything else that people would like to talk about, or? All right. Okay, so then I guess I just want to thank everybody for attending today. I guess I also want to remind you that for any faculty staff who are here, that these unlearned activities count for CCPD credit. And for any students and faculty and staff as well, all of these events can be counted towards winning a free Unlearn t-shirt. So you can follow the instructions for doing that. I will share with you in the comments a link for that in just a minute. But I guess to wrap things up, I'd like to pose another question to all of our panelists about maybe sort of just ending on a positive note. How are libraries presenting positive examples of working towards inclusion and fighting racism? And what can people do to support libraries and this work together?
Well, I'll just go back to talking back to the clips that sort of started our whole discussion, which we couldn't see, but looking at the subject heading illegal aliens, and just how some of those things are being pulled out. So even though the Library of Congress got a lot of pushback and hasn't yet implemented any changes or the recommended changes that they were working towards as undocumented immigrants, and there were some other a variety of different subject headings that they were playing around with. I did some searching just to see what has happened in the last 3 or 4 years since that discussion, the end of the documentary that came out, and people are moving forward. It was a little bit stuck because of COVID, but I noticed that there was a discussion over in some virtual conferences this summer where some of the libraries are saying, you know what, we're making the decision. We're not waiting any longer for Library of Congress to do this, to make these changes. We're striking out on our own, and we think that this is an important thing, and are going to move forward and make those changes, whether a Library of Congress does it or not. I didn't talk about this, but before, that is a huge thing, because most libraries and special technical services areas don't have a lot of people. We depend upon the shared metadata from Library of Congress, from other libraries, to really keep our costs down and our processes moving smoothly and moving forward. And so to strike out away from the herd, to move away from the Library of Congress and how the majority libraries are cataloging and processing materials, is a really big deal. And I think they'll touch on that in the documentary later. But some libraries are saying, you know what, this is important to us. This is important to our students. This is a place where we feel we need to take a stand, and we are going to change these things. It was one of those things that I had been looking at for our department here at Heckman, and then COVID hit and some other stuff happened. But it was one of those things like, we should probably talk between our technology people and my library staff and see what do we want to do in terms of this specific subject heading to make some changes and to move forward with that discussion. So that's one thing. Library of Congress still stuck, no change there, but other people are like, you know what, we need to make a stand. We're moving forward. So.
Yes, and that's a good reminder as well. A good reminder for everybody, if you're interested in watching the whole documentary for Change the Subject and the story about working to change that subject heading at Library of Congress, you can join us for our watch party. That'll be tonight at 7, and the link will be posted. I'm going to share that in our chat right now. The live link will be posted in our library website at this blog post here. You can also find in that blog post some more information for educating yourself on some of the things that we've been talking about today and more, talking about representation of people of color in libraries, talking about, you know, continuing this discussion. And with that, I'd like to thank again our wonderful panelists for contributing your insight today and your experiences. And also thank you to all of you attendees for being here and being a part of our conversation. I'm going to wrap things up here, but I'd like to share with you also that information about getting the free t-shirt. So we can say goodbye for now, and I'll share that information. So thank you all, and thank you panelists once again.